Here's a South African wine pop quiz for you. What is the coldest wine producing region in the country? Now, if you were to make an educated guess, you probably would pick on 4 regions as potentially being the coldest. There's Agulhas and the Elam ward within it, which is the southernmost wine producing region on the entire African continent. And perhaps then you'd go a little further round the coast to the west and you'd reach Walker Bay and Hemel and Arda Valley, which is right on the coast. So it has the Atlantic Ocean on its doorstep. And then with a similar setup, you might move over to Constantia and consider that as one of the coldest because it's practically surrounded by the Atlantic. Or if you're sick of coastal regions, perhaps your guesswork would take you inland, right up to Elgin, which is a little bowl on top of a mountain. And they have vineyards that sit at between 250 meters above sea level, all the way up to almost 900 meters above sea level. And they get cold air from the Atlantic Ocean coming in over the Overberg. Or going even higher still, you might want to visit the Ceres Plateau, which is over 1,000 meters above sea level and gets snow every single winter. So which one of these 4 would you pick as being your coldest region in South Africa? Well, there is an out-and-out winner, you'll be pleased to hear, but it's not as simple as just looking at who has the lowest average temperature. Rather, it's about accumulating cold units, which are kind of like smart shopper points, but for low temperatures. And so for every hour that a vine sits in an ambient temperature of between 0 degrees Celsius and 7 degrees Celsius, that is 1 cold unit. You think, well, that's easy enough. We'll just count those up and surely that's linked to lowest average temperature. Well, not entirely, because it's not just the number of cold units, but it's also when those cold units occur. So the 3 most important times that vines need to stay super icy are really in the winter. They need the temperature to be low so that they can get the equivalent of a really good night's sleep. Then in early spring, they also need the temperature to remain low because everyone hates that feeling when you wake up with a fright and then feel nauseous for the rest of the day. Well, that's kind of what happens to vines if it gets too warm in early spring. And when they bud, they need nice, cool conditions. And finally, the 3rd time that they really need cold weather is in autumn, right after they've been harvested. And this is essentially so they can get what we in our 40s would call an early night after a really long, hard slog of ripening fruit for us humans. But even if you get cold units in all of those important times, the competition gets even more nuanced because there's different systems for counting cold units. Some systems would give bonus points if it's between 2 and 7 rather than just 0 and 7, because this is the Goldilocks zone. And other more sophisticated systems will actually count the way these units occur together in larger stretches or shorter stretches. But all murkiness aside, I did promise you an out-and-out winner. And so the number 1 most frigid wine producing region in South Africa is Elgin, the bowl on top of the mountain. And if you want to know who sits on the podium with them, 2nd place is Hemel and Arda Valley. And then 3rd place is the Ceres Plateau with their snowy winters and their 1,000 meters above sea level. After that, it gets a little more gray because it's hard to know whether it's Agulhas and Elam specifically or Constantia that would come in 4th. And this is partially because the southern half of Constantia is quite a bit colder than the northern half, for example. So which side do you measure when competing against Agulhas? So what I've done is, rather than give you a definitive answer here, I've left some notes and comments from winemakers and viticulturists who work in these regions, and you can read those all on the Hand Drink Solo website. Now, the reason that we're even talking about the delightfully geeky topic of cold units is because today's Hand Drink Solo wine of the day is the Almenkerk Chardonnay, made with fruit from the very cold Elgin wine region. And it's vinified by the delightfully geeky winemaker Cameron Corney. Now, if you want to stay up to speed with this sort of geeky wine stuff, then be sure to subscribe to the Hand Drink Solo YouTube channel, where we have more than 300 videos like this one. And give us a like because it helps more people like you to find our content. In the last month or so, we've been talking on a number of occasions about the importance of family-run estates within the South African winelands and how they bring with them decades and generations of accumulated knowledge about the behavior of vines and weather and soil in one particular place. Now, when it comes to Almenkerk family only bought the estate in 2002. So the team, headed up by Joris Almenkerk and his wife Natalie, really are only at the very beginning of that generations-long legacy. But Joris is an enormously scientifically minded man and incurably curious as well. And so he really did employ all the latest technologies when it came to studying the soil and solar radiation levels and the climate. And he, of course, went and consulted all those who had been on the land before him. So perhaps what he lacked in generations of accumulated knowledge and hard toil, he at least partially mitigated with a supreme sense of diligence. Joris is also a delightful sort of out-of-the-box winemaker, and so any chance to listen to him talk about his wines and his estate is well worth taking. Perhaps even more excitingly for wine geeks around the world, Joris has brought on board the winemaker Corney, who is a mental mile-a-minute kind of guy who loves keeping these little weird A/B experiments bubbling away on the side in barrels and tanks, where he will compare things like different yeast strains compared next to one another, or perhaps different levels of skin content, or even taking 3 or 4 very narrow bands of ripeness, fermenting those grapes in separate portions, and then really closely noting the aromatics and volatiles that come out of each tank so that he knows exactly what he's going to get from any parcel at that particular ripeness level. Cameron is also the sort of winemaker who talks about flavors in colors, which means he really is our sort of guy. Now, when chatting to Cameron about the wine in the glass, he explains to us that the fruit for this wine come from 2 different vineyards that are planted with very different Chardonnay clones. And when we talk of clones, just as a little reminder, we're talking about the fact that once upon a time, there were Chardonnay vines growing in different places around the world. And in each of these different climates, 1 or 2 of those vines may have developed small little mutations and slowly changed bit by bit. And then one day, people came along and thought, this vine is particularly delicious, and they would then take cuttings from that and go and isolate those and propagate those qualities through future generations of those vines. If you need an analogy, I guess it is like identical twins who are perhaps separated at birth and then grow up in completely different cultures and different countries. Those 2 twins, while being genetically mostly identical, will express themselves in very different ways. And so it is with Chardonnay clones. The 2 clones we're talking about today are Clone 3 and Clone 96. Clone 3 is noted for its huge yields and often slightly more neutral flavors. In fact, it can be used for bubbly because it preserves amazing natural acidity. But an interesting little fact about Clone 3 is that it also produces really small berries with much thicker skins, and so what you get is this impressive texture. Now, as far as Cameron's concerned, he'd almost say it's not really about the flavor in the glass, it really is about this intense texture that comes with these smaller berries. The second block is planted with a Dijon clone 96. And when it comes to either Pinot Noir or Chardonnay, the Dijon clones are like the OGs, the ones that everyone thinks are the gold standard. Now, clone CY96, while it may not have the same yields that clone 3 can give, it presents an absolute explosive kaleidoscope of flavors and aromas. It is an aromatic superhero with a nose that puts Depardieu and Streisand to shame. And then beyond the aromas, on the palate, it's fruitier than Val Kilmer in Kiss Kiss Bang Bang and presents this incredible array of fruit dynamics. So in the end, when you blend a clone like CY3 with its structure and texture with a clone like CY96 with its superhero aromatics and amazing fruit elements, you get a really interesting wine indeed. But let's see if it delivers. So when you give it a sniff, well, it certainly is generous, and we get a number of different elements. We get a kind of lemon bonbon candy note with lemon leaf and then lime juice, but there's also more savory, surly notes. There's a gun smoke, macadamia nut as well. It's one of those noses that you can sniff for ages before you even take a sip because it's quite intricate and there's beautiful balance between those primary lemon leaf and fresh limes, but also nutmeg, macadamia nut, a touch of smoke. Now, when we give it a sip, well, the first thing you cannot avoid but noticing is the beautiful, steely, razor-sharp, down-the-middle, Granny Smith apple acidity. It is so pristine and makes me think of some of the finer Chablis Chardonnays that you might experience, which, if you don't know what Chablis is, it kind of produces some of the most steely, esteemed French Chardonnays in existence. But then, balancing that beautiful Granny Smith acidity is a sweeter, slightly more generous lime cordial note. And the length of this wine is every bit as impressive as the other elements. I mean, that acidity just goes and goes and goes. And the finish is longer than P. Diddy's rap sheet. Okay, so that's all we have time for today, but I have left links to 2 videos. The first of which will help you be really cool and learn how to talk flavors in colors, like Cameron Corney. And the second goes into a little bit of history about how the Elgin wine industry came to be.